Well, I'm here today with Elaine Howard Ecklund, and I want to do this introduction right because her academic credentials are fabulous and awesome. She is Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology in the Rice University Department of Sociology. She also directs the Religion and Public Life program at their Social Sciences Institute. And she's also a part of their department as an affiliate member, if I'm not mistaken, in their Department of Religion. She's written a lot of books, two of which I'm promoting behind me to my left ear. The first is Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, and that's from Oxford University Press in 2010. Christopher Scheidl's book, Religions versus Science, What Religious People Really Think, and that's also Oxford from 2018. And then more recently, Science and Secularity, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion, again, an Oxford book from 2019. And finally, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other from Brazos Press that came out this year in 2020. She's also written, this is a very technical term, gazillions of scholarly articles that I cannot possibly keep up with. And Elaine, you're such a good friend among everything else. I love the way you do your work. You're an amazing scholar, incredibly brilliant. And even though you're younger than me, you're a mentor to me. And I appreciate that as you've mentored many other people. So thank you for your work. Thank you for what you bring to this field of science and religion.
Oh, Greg, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate, is it okay that we're going by our first names? I can call you Greg?
That's totally good. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I really, really appreciate
My cat just entered the room, so everything's got to be a little more formal.
Everything's
right?
got to be cash. Thank you for having me. And just thank you for that generous introduction. I really, really appreciate that. That means a lot to me coming from you. So thanks. Although I do feel in this moment like I'm not particularly creative about the book titles, that I really got that when you say them all at once. I don't think people usually say all of the titles at once. That really think motif is like I'm really drummed that. So I thought it was cool, but now that I hear it years later, I'm not so sure.
I mean, you know, it's actually one of the things that I think you bring is you don't let us get comfortable with stereotypes. And I imagine we're going to get into that actually. So maybe that's the way to start. You know, what interests you in this topic or the topics related to science and religion, and how did you get into this field?
That's a good question. So there are a couple of different kinds of things. There's kind of the personal side, and then there's like the scholarly side, the stuff you say at conferences. And so maybe I'll start with the personal, which might be most interesting to your listenership. So I always liked science. I was raised in a family that did not have scientists, but I would say that from a young age, I was raised in a farming community in upstate New York. There was the sense that the natural world was beautiful. I spent a ton of time outdoors as a kid. I did little science experiments. I remember finding out that, like polywogs could grow into frogs and being really intrigued by that and capturing some and not quite getting that they needed air to survive and putting them in a can and then they all died. I don't know. I'm not sure.
That's kind of an early science experiment of sorts, right?
And then I was like, why did they die? Like I fed them so much food. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they don't need just food. They need air as well. So I always loved science, I think. And even though I didn't know very many scientists, I was also raised in a really devout family. So my grandparents raised me. They went to church every Sunday. It was the kind of church that was not terribly supportive of science or scientists, and actually was deeply afraid of scientists. So fast forward many years, I think I grew up with the kind of rhetoric and practices that led me to believe personally that there was a massive conflict between being a scientist and being a person of faith. So that was kind of part of my fabric. I didn't struggle with any of the typical issues. I would say to people, I didn't know enough about evolution or something like human reproductive genetic technologies to struggle, right? You have to know something to struggle.
Right.
But I did think that there was kind of an inherent conflict between science and faith. Later on, I actually just kept loving science and I thought very seriously about chucking the faith part. But I came along in college with a group of Christian young adults who really were very thoughtful, very intellectual Christians. And I learned how to hold those things together, the science and the faith, and to not see them at all in conflict. In fact, I kept loving science so much, I fell in love with a scientist. My husband, Carl, is a particle physicist, as you know. And he actually had the idea for my very first research project, the one that's science versus faith, science versus religion. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the titles of my own books. That's like, this is like COVID brain. I'm so
well, you write so many books. I think it's pardonable for sure. And by the way, my cat is doing a very interesting cat study to my right, where she's in one of the drawers looking for earplugs. She loves little earplugs. So anyway, that's like, partly why I keep muting in and out. But
that's not the title of my book. Wait, look down, Elaine, look down. I'm holding it down here actually in front of me. So, and you have it behind you, so I'll just read it now. It's science versus religion, what scientists really think. But in all seriousness, I found a flyer for a grant, and I threw it in the trash. It was a call for proposals. So that's when academics are invited to write a proposal for a research project to get money to do research. And my husband, Carl, was like, oh my gosh, that's a call to study what scientists think about religion. Like, don't throw that away. You could do that. You're a social scientist. And he's like, I'm, a person who has faith myself, and I'm a scientist. And I feel like people in church communities have so many stereotypes, and people in the science community have so many stereotypes about people of faith and Christians in particular. He's like, why did you study that to see if those stereotypes on both sides are true? And that kind of was like a little spark for me. And I just got super, super interested in the topic. So it's kind of like the personal and the professional coming together for me. I hope it's okay to say that. Usually, like when we get up and give conference presentations, we're like, here's all the scholarly literature that, led to the project. And it wasn't really that way for me at all. There isn't much of a social science literature on science and faith. And so I kind of just was like, let's just do this. Let's figure out what larger groups of people think about these things rather than just paying attention to the loudest voices.
Well, I mean, I think what's so interesting about you and Carl is obviously you're a leading social scientist. What are you, president of the Society for the Social Scientific Study of Religion?
Yes, I was.
Is that right?
Yeah, I was until this year. So that was fun.
Yeah, so that's a huge honor. That doesn't given away easily. You gave the Gifford Lectures, which is one of the most prestigious set of lectures in the world. People like William James, Alfred North Whitehead. Who else did they tell you was there? Because I remember they gave you like a big pump up of the other people that were there.
Alistair McGrath, like lots of famous.
Alistair McGrath, John Polkinghorne, Anyway, so you've got your bona fides and bona fide, excuse me, and then your husband Carl goes. Not only does he do his work at Rice, but he goes to CERN every year and does his work. So, I mean, that's a cool factor. That's unbelievable. And it shows that you are engaged in this at a high level, and it means a lot to you. And then I think what's really fascinating is you've been able to keep that professional, Elaine, help me with the word you'd use, but your distance from this work at the same time of being personally engaged at a certain level. Is that the right way to describe it?
Yeah,
or how would you describe both the personal engagement and the requirements of being a good scholar of sociology and of social scientific research?
Well, here I am going to get a little scholarly, Greg. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
I do think social science is really complicated that way. And this is a good thing to talk to students about. So my husband is a particle physicist. So he studies the smallest concepts and pieces of the universe and tries to figure out how they work together to make things happen. But we would think he was really crazy if his particles started talking back to him, right? And he was like, oh my gosh, just what the lepton said today. But, social science is really different because we as social scientists are inside the social systems that we're studying. And so we're really impacted by the people around us that we study. So I've learned a lot from my respondents. But we also, I think, to do social science well, must retain some measure of objectivity. And I would say almost a kind of weak objectivity, in the sense that we want to make sure we're honest about the ways in which our work has an impact on us as scholars and how that might have an impact on our scholarship. But we also try to get in communities of other scholars that help us see things in different ways, so that we can maintain what I think of as a truthful perspective. We want to try to tell the truth as much as possible, as much as humanly possible, about the social world and how it works. So in my studies of scientists, obviously, I know of the work of scientists who are really outspoken atheists. Someone like Richard Dawkins, who as stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for his The God Delusion book for many weeks. Sam Harris, others. And so I wanted to figure out, is that accurate? These folks, these men primarily, who write so much about the ways in which scientific thought and faith are deeply incompatible. Is that perspective true of a wide variety of scientists in different disciplines across different national locations? So I was trying to figure out if that's true. Now, I think, as someone who thinks of herself as a committed Christian, as I do, I wanted to be really careful that I wasn't, too hopeful that scientists were Christians, if that makes sense, that I was joining with other scholars who could really help me be accurate. In fact, my scholarly colleagues say that sometimes I overcompensate, like I'm seeking to work with atheists because, I want to make sure that we have a variety of perspectives present. But I think it's really important for scholars to be self-aware. I think that's, I went on a little bit about that because I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. I do think as a sociologist and as a social scientist, I am a scientist, but I think I'm a scientist in a different kind of way, in a way, quite frankly, that I think is a little bit more philosophically complex than the type of scientific work that, say, my husband as a particle physicist does.
Wow. There's so much there that you said, and I'm glad you did go on. There's two of the questions that I immediately, two questions that I had put in that I want to make sure we address, and you can address them either way, because I think they came out of what you just said. One is, is there a particular angle you bring to this conversation of science and religion? That's one. And the second one is, what are some new insights that you've had, and what are some surprises? So I think both of those were there. Feel free to take either side, and I'll try to make sure I get both of those questions in, and both of your answers into our time.
Yeah, those are really good. Those are smart questions. I think that as a sociologist, so sociologists study group level behaviors. They use a variety of different kinds of methods, often surveys, where you get large numbers of people to take your surveys, but surveys are weak in terms of the nuance of the question. So the researcher herself decides the exact answer choices that the person has when they fill out the survey. We also use observational methods, where we get in the laboratory, say, from studying scientists, with people and observe what they're doing. And we also interview people. Those are three of the main methods that we use. But the whole idea of sociology is to try to figure out group level behaviors. So what do scientists as a collective, or groups of particular scientists, think about specific issues like religion? What do particular groups of religious people think about science? And I think that sociology brings a kind of unique perspective to the whole discussion on science and faith, because much of the literature, very good literature that I've benefited from a lot, actually, has been based in theology. It's been based in philosophy. It's been based in ethics. It's been based in history. And those disciplines, with the exception of history, really are a bit more oriented towards the range of ways people ought to act, the kinds of truth claims, really dissecting the kinds of truth claims that people make. And what sociology is also interested in truth claims, but the kinds of group level truth claims. So how do whole groups of people think about something?
Right.
That's a long answer. Is there anything there you want to follow up on?
That's really good. And I think that is a little bit different. So when I did my doctoral work in science and religion, science and theology, there's a lot of focus on, some key thinkers, like on on the conflict side, you might have a Richard Dawkins. On the independent side, a Stephen Jay Gould. I was particularly interested in people who integrated the science and religion in different ways. So one of my doctoral advisors, Robert John Russell, is a physicist who brings his physics to his religious and theological reflection. Alfred North Whitehead, who died in the last century, was somebody I studied. So we often do that kind of work in science and religion on individuals, but you're bringing the sociological perspective, which, to be frank, when I finished my PhD about 25 years ago, it wasn't really as prominent. So in a way, I think you've been part of this move toward bringing a sociological angle on science and religion. So what you said makes a lot of sense to me. And when you study those groups, you've had some surprises. I mean, I'll try out a couple things that seem like they come from your books. This is my reading test for the moment. That the narrative that this is of your huge Rasic, or Rasic is the way you pronounce it, or Rasic, right? Research, and you can describe what that is. You didn't find that there was the enduring conflict which many people have as a conception or a stereotype between scientists and religion, or people who are religious and people who are scientists. Another thing that was really profound is that how much religious people, and even sometimes the hard case, you might say, that Protestant evangelicals are very pro-science, with certain exceptions that are interesting. And then also one of the things that I came away really surprised by and challenged by was religious people, particularly Christians, are underrepresented in the elite scientific organizations. So I don't know, those are a few things. How would you unfold those? How would you describe those conceptions or misconceptions of this group of people who engage in science and religion?
Those are great. You passed the reading test. I mean,
good.
I know
All right.
that was not the purpose of this interview, but you did totally pass. I was like, oh wait, that is what I said. It's very helpful.
Right.
So another thing which is related, which I wanted to mention, which I think sociologists bring in, which I bring in particular as a scholar, is this emphasis on how social location has an impact on how you see the world. And some of the findings from the research that you noticed as surprises, maybe from your own knowledge base, Greg, are things that I think I picked up, or my collaborators picked up, because of our own social locations. And so I think being a woman matters. The fact that I was raised in a Christian community matters. The fact that I'm an academic matters. All of those things really matter, I think, in how I see the social world. And actually, rather than being a hindrance to objectivity, might actually bring a fuller understanding of certain pieces of the social world, or make me attend to certain pieces. And one of the things that I've been attending to lately, and I know you're passionate about as well, is seeing more racial and ethnic equality in science. And part of this came through my studies of religion and science, ironically. So I noticed in my broader studies of religion that Black and Hispanic people are really overrepresented. So a larger proportion of them participate in faith communities, particularly conservative Christian communities, than are present in the general population. And so quite a large group of people, in fact, depending on the study, nearly 90% of Black Americans participate in a Christian community, compared to less than 70%, about 65% of white Americans. And so that's a pretty vast difference. And when I studied those communities, and I started to realize that there were some interesting tensions with faith and science that weren't present in largely white communities, that there was a sense that maybe science was not a discipline or a body of knowledge that had always fought for justice. There was a kind of collective memory of the Tuskegee syphilis trials, for example, where the US government did not tell men that were infected with syphilis that they were infected, to study them inappropriately. And the fact that that happened, and the kind of, I think we can safely call that an evil act on the part of our government, the fact that that happened has been passed along in communities of color, particularly Black communities, and is one of the reasons perhaps that members of Black communities are not as trusting of medicine and medical communities as they might be. And these
Yes.
kind of things can be passed on in churches. And churches are also places, scientists usually don't think about it this way. They usually think, or often think, of religious organizations as a kind of problem for science. But looked at a different way, religious organizations can be a benefit for science, in that in both Black and Hispanic communities and Asian communities to some extent, religious organizations are often very pro-education. Some of them actually give scholarships to kids who go to college, hold after-school programs, especially in low-income communities. And so I've started dreaming lately about what it would mean to partner between what it would look like, rather, for scientists and the scientific community to partner with faith communities. And I think that's kind of interesting, in particular as it relates to increasing underrepresented minority representation in science. And here I'm talking in particular about Black and Hispanic communities. So that's kind of a surprising thing for me that's happened more recently in my research. And I think may in part be as a result of my own social location and the types of things I've attended to. In my past, I've been very involved in Black church communities in certain seasons in my life. And I think there's ways in which our own social locations can help us notice and help things show up for us that they might not otherwise. And so I think that's kind of interesting.
Wow.
That's been a surprise for me.
Yeah, there's so much there. I almost feel like I should just listen. Just what I don't know. It's just so fascinating to hear what you're saying. And one of the things that I think is fascinating in this is how I was just reading an article that demonstrated that science is actually impoverished by the lack of diversity of viewpoints. I mean, from a scientific point of view, like if you just wanted to think about race and racism from a kind of structural, but also pragmatic way, science is impoverished when when it becomes merely a white male enterprise, or primarily, right? And so this particular report was saying we need to make sure we engage communities of color for the sake of science, let alone to work toward anti-racism in our country. And so that's fascinating. Of course, there's issues with gender that you mentioned, and one of the recent pieces of research that I've been thinking about is how so often women are told that they're not good at math, right? And then you have these surveys that indicate that actually has a kind of recursive stereotype. So then women who do math tests think, oh, I'm not very good at it, and they don't score as well. And there's a similar body of research this is particularly with Christians, that Christians are told you don't do well at science. And so when they do work in science and testing, they're seen to actually perform less well because of that. And so all of that adds up to me as a person who's really fascinated and engaged with this topic. This is not good for our country, right? I mean, our country has a diversity, a racial diversity, which is one of our strengths. Obviously, we have, people who come to science who aren't just men, right? And how can we engage that full diversity and therefore get the most engagement with science as a culture and as a country? So I find that fascinating, and it's great that your research has uncovered that. I mean, is there anything that you could see? I know sociologists are they're hesitant to bring practical, like, here's what you must do with this, ethical, like, imperatives. But is there something you think we should do as a culture out of the kinds of research that you've undertaken and the results that you've found?
Yeah, so my first foray into writing for a really broad public audience with a book is this most recent book, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values That Move Us Beyond Fear. And Greg, you've of course been so kind to help promote that book and be part of that. Where in that book, I do try to grapple with theology and also write specifically for a church community and give really practical tools that churches in particular, and a different book could be written for a different kind of community as a science outreach, but I thought I was equipped, given my background, to shape my research towards Christian communities, and I'm very comfortable doing that as part of my outreach work. And one very practical thing church communities can do is bring in a diverse set of scientists to speak to children about their love of science. What we usually do is we have debates. There's a place for debates about knowledge frameworks. I get that. Or we have what I might call kind of talks that are educational for Christian communities or religious communities more broadly. I've seen this happen in mosques and synagogues as well, where we address for kids and young adults, oh, here's all the ways you can overcome the supposed conflict between religion and science. I'm not talking about that kind of work. What I would like to see, and I think what the research points to, is that if just having a diverse group of scientists, so what about a scientist who is him or herself a Black Christian, come and just talk about their love of science. So some of my research has shown that the social location of the person, the messenger for science, just really matters. And it can act as a kind of a role model or an exemplar for kids and young adults about science. And so I think that churches, what if churches were seen the kinds of religious organizations that are often blamed and accurately so in some cases for being in conflict with science and holding back science, what if they were seen as being the kinds of organizations that actually fostered science diversity? I think that's a kind of partnership that could happen between scientific communities and between faith communities.
And I love that. And I love that book, the way it's formed around these virtues. And one of those virtues, of course, that we discussed in another actually recording was curiosity, which I think, brings us back to that really key, speaking of churches, the Christian value of becoming like children. And, I've often thought about that. Becoming like children isn't really, becoming unintelligent or becoming, childish and thinking. It's actually, I think it's evoking humility and curiosity. That's what children, I think, are being, in the words of Jesus, are being raised up to as models for us. And as you bring scientists into those communities around children, one of the things I think happens is you bring that curiosity. You bring that sense of wonder about the world around us. And we ask questions, we make discoveries. And that's, I think, where there's a really, I don't want to say easy, but I kind of want to say easy, an easy point of connection between a religious community, especially in this case, the church and scientists. And I don't know, I love that about the book that you've just written, how it has the virtues and the ethical, that kind of character formation, and how it has really practical elements that, as you said, could be multiplied in other religious communities. And I just think that's super, to use a highly scholarly word, super fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's my hope. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, go ahead, please. Yeah.
I was just going to say that my hope is that might be a kind of start, that I've actually encouraged some of my students and postdocs to write books for their communities. So what would it look like for people who do this kind of research to try on different sorts of translation projects where they translate the work to their community and make it relevant to their particular community? So that's what I try to do in the Why Science and Faith Meet Each Other book. But I'd love to see a book like that written for mosques. And there's some great scientists doing work in this area. And so I just love to see different kinds of books like this written by others. So I want to encourage the listeners there, if this is something that's you're interested in, to consider taking on a project like this of your own.
Well, it's certainly one of the things that project that I'm engaging in is, and been thinking about, is how do various religions see science? And this would be a really fascinating way to do it. Like, let's take science into a mosque or an ashram or into nature, right? With a nature-based religion. What would it look like? What would that interface be? Well, Elaine, I feel like I've taken a lot of your time in this, and I'm so thankful to have this time to hear from you and for the listeners to get your insights. Is there any last thing that you'd want to leave people with, or something that I didn't ask you that you want to make sure we hear?
In this time of kind of polarized public discussion, I mean, it's like we see polarization all around us. I do think that collaborative work on science and faith can point the way forward for what civil dialogue and community, scholarly community, and community more broadly in our society looks like. I think your own work, Greg, in Science for the Church is really leading the way there, and you're teaching. And so just want to encourage your students and others that I do think that we can be part of really generative dialogue. And that's something of a lost art, but I think we can gain some tools in the science and faith conversation for doing that well more broadly.
Well, Elaine, it's not only something that you desire to have happen, it's something that you do so well. And thank you for this time in this time of conversation. Again, I appreciate your work a great deal. I appreciate who you are, and thanks again.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today. I really appreciate this opportunity.